Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. 14 years ago tonight, Hurricane Katrina had swept through southeast Louisiana, leaving collapsed flood walls and broken levees in its path. We'll look back tonight at the storm and what we've learned about the science behind it, as well as the new methods for reporting on future storms. This anniversary happens during a week when street flooding seems to be a growing issue. We'll look for answers. We'll also look at the case of a state Supreme Court justice who dodged federal prosecution, and we will hear a reporter's disturbing findings about the fate of some retired racehorses. On a happier note, our Future Watch segment previews the new Children's Museum, which opens tomorrow. At the table for us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Mark Schleifstein, environmental reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate; Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter; and John Zimmerman, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go over to Errol first, and street flooding. It's happened in New Orleans for years and years and years and years and years and years, but some folks are saying maybe it might be a little bit worse right now.
Well, I think the discussion is changing now. There's a different focus. The last couple of years was all about the pumps. Now it doesn't seem to be about the pumps, it seems to be about the pipes. Let me tell you, when they pulled that car out, that is going to be a symbol of New Orleans streets like 100 years from now. When people talk about this, it reminds me in Cleveland when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, yeah. And people said, we got a problem here, okay? And when they pulled that car out of the pipes, I think that really, if people weren't concerned before, I think it really sent a signal. And I think what makes change a little bit easier is that it's a new crowd at Sewage and Water Board. It's a new administration within the board. It's a new administration in City Hall. So they don't have to defend any. They don't have to be defending themselves. They can almost look back at the past and said, "Let's go ahead and make changes." And so I think that's what's happening now. And the Sewage and Water Board has said that they're going to look more into the pipes and the drainage. And one theory that's coming is a few years ago, when they did all that work along Napoleon and they widened it, now they're saying maybe it's too much of a water flow, that when it gets to the areas where the pipes aren't as good, that it's causing flooding.
Yeah, the big drainage culverts,
yeah.
Right.
So there are a lot of questions out there now.
And it was Napoleon and then Claiborne and a couple of other places too, where it was the Army Corps of Engineers who was putting those huge culverts in there, and then they're turned over to the Sewage and Water Board to run.
Their analogy was always they're big enough to drive a school bus
Right,
through.
exactly.
So they are huge underground tunnels.
But the concern is right now that they're so efficient now in draining water from those areas where they were installed that water is being pushed into other areas of town that maybe didn't see as much flooding in the past.
I'm not quite sure that's really the case,
Mm-hmm.
because where it goes is to the pumping stations, and the pumping stations go to other canals and out to the lakes. So there's really kind of hard to get from those drainage areas out into the areas that are flooding.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately what happens when you see a storm like what happened yesterday on Tuesday was that we had 4 inches of rain in an hour. And we just don't have a system that's designed to deal with that.
Does anyone?
But no one does. But there are some additional problems that we have to deal with. One of them is that we have a Sewage and Water Board that's been getting a lot of blame for this interior flooding, when it's really not their fault, but rather the city's streets department and public works department, because they're in charge of the interior drainage. And so that's one of the things that has to be straightened out, is coordination between the two of them. A lot of this stuff like that car, why wasn't that car seen immediately after Katrina as being in those areas? We've got to have a better system designed to check all of these large drainage area that's 300 years old.
Well, supposedly they are now starting to investigate those big culverts a little bit more to see what's actually in them. Now, having found a car, about a week and a half ago, and lifted that thing out. And then in terms of the Sela projects, those big culverts that were installed in Napoleon and elsewhere, there is a study, I think, that's going on. We should know in the next couple of weeks or so if that is having an impact.
Right. So we will see an answer to that question. I'm just not convinced that that's the real problem. I think it really is more a question of the interior drainage and all of the, the collection areas that just have not been adequately addressed for quite
And
a
one
while.
thing that's always a problem, I think everybody will agree too, is paying for these kind of things. And we're seeing the thing when in the downtown area that Mayor Cantrell is trying to get the downtown development district, which has the power to regulate millages, not to roll back some millages I was talking about, and to keep it at the level so that this money can be funneled into repairs, because it really becomes news when it hits downtown and when the shops start flooding downtown.
Although with more and more properties selling downtown and more people living there, the revenues should be up automatically without new or continued taxes. There should be a higher base of resources from which to take money and help with drainage instead of adding taxes to downtown. But that's a story for another day.
Well, New Orleans,
And the argument is that their property taxes have increased too,
Right.
and so.
New Orleans historically has flooded,
But not this
and
much, this often.
with these really heavy rains. Look, I can remember, I've lived in this town long enough, like all my life, which is getting to be a pretty old one now. And being flooded in the CBD, just having these summer storms come up, and there you go, the streets are flooded. Being at a restaurant like at Commander's and
Not
being
being
flooded.
able to leave.
Right. So
The
it's
one
not a brand new thing.
But there are some other underlying issues. The city is sinking, and all of our land is sinking, and so that's an additional problem. And then after Katrina, the city sped up the process of getting approvals to rebuild houses.
Yeah.
And by doing so, in a lot of cases, what happened was that they lowered the amount of damage for a home, and the result of that was that they were not required to meet the new standards for
elevation.
elevating their houses. And so a lot of houses weren't elevated, and they're still, they're
And we're
liable to flood.
And we're still flooding. So, okay, let's talk about Katrina now. Go back
Katrina.
over to you. 14 years, for so many of it truly feels like yesterday. How have things improved in terms of forecasting? We're in the middle of hurricane season. And
Well, there's been a dramatic improvements, not just in forecasting, but in getting the forecast information to the public and the kinds of information. If you remember before Katrina, we did not have storm surge predictions in advance of a hurricane. We had them, but they were for emergency managers only. Now there are actual watches and warnings with maps that go out to the public for that. In addition, the narrow, the cone of uncertainty for a hurricane has dramatically reduced. So now it's only about 50 miles across as opposed to 80 to 90 miles across at the time of Katrina. To the point where the National Hurricane Center and the Hurricane Research Division are talking about having to readdress the way that the public sees these messages, and especially those cones, to make sure that they understand that that cone doesn't mean that that's the only place where the hurricane's forces can be. It's only where that little dot of the center of the storm goes. And people need to recognize that when a major hurricane occurs, like with Katrina, it was 450 miles across. We had effects all the way in Tallahassee, Florida, all the way to the west of Galveston from that one storm. You could have that today with a hurricane, and it's not just in that little cone. So people have to understand that as well.
Barry was kind of an example too, because those outer bands, got Mobile area didn't hit us so much.
Exactly, and Barry is another issue that's there, which is that they've done a really great job of forecasting where the storms go, but what's still missing is that last piece, which is intensity. And in Barry's case, they were unable to figure out exactly what was happening, why it was taking so long to form. In other cases, like the hurricane that's out there now, there's a difficulty on the part of the forecasters to determine when there's what they call rapid intensification.
Yeah.
Mark, this is an informed sources tradition. Every year when we talk about Katrina, when we have you on, I always ask you to tell the story about the phone call you got that day as Katrina was approaching.
Yeah, about 4 o'clock on Saturday before the storm, I'm at my desk and
At the Picayune?
at the Picayune, and the former editor of the Picayune and the former publisher were standing over me while I'm arguing that we should use a map they got from LSU showing a flooding of the city that would be equivalent to what happened during Hurricane Betsy. Basically New Orleans East would flood. And I get a call, and it's Max Mayfield, who at the time was the director of the National Hurricane Center. And the first questions out of his mouth before I had a chance to even say hello were, "Mark, how high is your building? What kinds of winds can it withstand?" And the publisher told me afterwards that I turned white, and he knew that we needed to do something with the model that we were looking at. I explained to Max that our building where we were was third floor, was high enough, we were safe. It was a pretty structurally sound building, although if one goes out there today,
Not even
it
close.
ain't
Doesn't
there no
exist.
more.
Yeah.
But it turned out that what he was really calling for was to find out whether or not Ray Nagin had gotten the message of what this storm was likely to do. And I said that I said correctly that Nagin did, and that he was about to announce a major evacuation process. But I also got him connected with the governor, and the governor and he and the mayor got together on the phone and made sure that the messages got out correctly to people.
Oh boy, a memory that is still so much there, and one that you really don't
rough
like
time,
recalling,
rough
right?
time.
And certainly don't want to live again. Okay, Mark, thanks a lot. John, over to you. You did a story that's really a disturbing story too. It's about racehorses here in the state of Louisiana. A lot of them just go off to meet a terrible fate.
And we're not sure how many of them, but the series that I did sort of traced how horses go into the slaughter pipeline from either from the racetrack or not long after they leave the racetrack. And it's hard to tell, how many hands, these horses go through. But what happened in this case is that they were sent into sort of the slaughter pipeline through an auction, a livestock auction. This is not a fancy racehorse auction. This is horses of all kinds. And they, this is, a lot of times that leads, and they were purchased by a kill buyer, what they call a kill buyer, somebody who normally shuttles horses, essentially a broker, a meat broker, to Mexico for slaughter. Slaughter of horses has been illegal for 12 years in the U.S., but there's the sort of end around where, somebody on the back stretch, you give your horse to, takes it to the auction, gets into the pipeline. In this case, one of these, quote, kill buyers had a kind of side racket, or has a side racket, that ransoms horses to well-meaning horse lovers online. And this happened over the course of about a year, involving a woman in New Jersey, a horse lover who got involved and created a nonprofit. They bought up dozens of horses, more than 100 horses, ended up coming to, or a lot of them ended up coming to Union Parish, where they were supposed to kind of stay there before going off to their adopted homes, or hopefully somebody would adopt them. It turns out a lot of them died and starved up there, so there were dozens of them. And that sort of Union Parish sheriffs have investigated for months, and they kind of the layers of this slaughter pipeline developed through that investigation.
Does Louisiana have any regulations, guidelines? So, does a racing commission look into what happens to these horses?
They do not. I mean, the position of the commission is essentially that when the horses leave the track, that slaughter is legal. And the tracks have their own policies, kind of under pressure, saying if we catch you trainers taking your horses from here to there, knowing it's going to the slaughter pipeline, you can't stable your horses here. But that has never been enforced, and the commission's sort of attitude is, look, when they're at the track and when they're racing, they're under our purview. Once they're on to new owners, the law doesn't allow us to do anything.
A thoroughbred is bred to run fast. It has those thin legs and those powerful muscles, but those attributes probably don't make them of much use for something after their racing life. There wouldn't be something for doing a workhorse or something.
Well, I think you'd get a lot of dispute over that from some of these folks who are rehoming horses to become trail horses or other kinds of recreational horses. There's a suggestion that they cost more to upkeep. They're these highly finely tuned horses, and so one of the reasons some people think these horses suffered the fate that they did up there is that the people who were taking care of them didn't quite realize they need more sort of high octane fuel for a while anyway. But that's kind of conjecture. They can be turned into different, have different uses for these horses is what I'm told. Whether there's enough demand to take all the racehorses that are retiring is an open question.
Basically, situation is status quo. You haven't seen any kind
Status
of big
quo.
change in it.
There's a trial in that Union Parish case
Okay.
scheduled for next month, but status quo.
And is this one person in particular that's doing it with the horses, or other breeders doing it, or do we know?
Well, that's part of it. Is like there's this sort of naming and shaming program going on online where you have these advocates like identifying these trainers who they think are bringing the horses to slaughter and trying to shame them, but there's no law. There's
Nothing
no teeth behind it.
Nothing really to stop it. All right, John, thanks a lot. Dawn, much happier story.
Much happier
The
story.
new Children's Museum in City Park opening on Saturday tomorrow.
Opening tomorrow. It's a $47.5 million, 8.5-acre facility, far different than the structure they had on Julia Street in an old building that has now been sold. So the Children's Museum and Julia Street, after more than 3 decades together, are no longer in partnership. This new facility in the middle of City Park, right on the lagoon, and a lot of the lagoon plays into the exhibits and what people will be able to see and explore there. The opening tomorrow is free, but it's a ticketed free visit to the museum. They are expecting to see 3,000 people come through the doors tomorrow at the museum, and expecting to see perhaps as many as 250,000 visitors in the first year. At its peak, really, on Julia Street before Katrina, they saw about 150,000 a year. I said, why do you think you'll have so many more in City Park? And the biggest reason is they're surrounded by neighborhoods. Instead, while the warehouse district is growing as a neighborhood, it's not really growing yet as a neighborhood with lots of children in it. They're in City Park. They are truly surrounded by neighborhoods. There's free parking that's easy, closer, convenient. They also have people who will have more, if you have to go to the park for a soccer game, or you're going to the art museum, or you're just going to explore the sculpture garden and it starts to rain, you have some place to go inside. It's 5 big exhibits, in them much smaller exhibits, but one that's focused on the Mississippi River all the way from Minnesota down to here and how the water moves. Another, Follow That Food, showing how Louisiana food is grown from the cropland all the way through the port, through the grocers, through the restaurants, ultimately to your table in some cases. A lot of interactive fun. A lot of the favorites from the Julia Street facility are moving over to City Park, or have moved over to City Park. My 13-year-old was like, Mom, are they going to still have the big bubbles? And they're still going to have the big bubbles, folks.
What about making groceries? Is that going to be there, do you know?
In a part of that Follow Your Food, but not quite the mini Rouses and the mini Winn-Dixie. I think it had several iterations over the years. The age range really for the museum is for younger kids. It's birth through age 8 is the target. But there's a lot of science, a lot more science than there was at the old museum. So they expect older kids to come and enjoy it as well. The $47.5 million, $28.5 million of it was public funding through capital outlay grants from the state of Louisiana. $19 million was from the private sector, and that $19 million came from people in 26 different states and 95 different cities, plus Washington, D.C. So a lot of support, not just here in New Orleans.
There's an outdoor section too, right?
Huge outdoor section. So it's the building itself is less than 1 acre. The whole property is 8.5 acres. So there's a lot outside as well.
And tomorrow, Saturday is not ticketed, but otherwise it will be ticketed.
Otherwise it will be ticketed. Longer hours this weekend. Open on Mondays when school is not in session. Otherwise they're open Tuesday through Sunday.
The other thing is that it's an incredibly beautiful building.
It is.
It's an important piece of architecture.
And it's the only LEED certified green building in the city park
and
ever.
the way it interplays with the lagoon, but also with the expansion of the sculpture garden, which is right down there, that whole area.
You can go to City Park and spend all day.
Even if you're not going to the
park is
museum,
really,
just to walk around and see the sculpture garden and the children's museum and just the architecture involved. It's incredible.
All right, I look forward to it. Thanks a lot. Mark, over to you. Kathleen Blanco really did a lot for the state in terms of coastal protection and restoration.
That's true. People forget the fact that after Katrina, she used the reality of what Katrina showed us to push hard and successfully to create the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority by pushing the laws through that others were pushing to get basically the Transportation Department and the Department of Natural Resources pieces together to create that agency. She also was the first person the first governor to actually object to a sale of offshore oil in the Gulf of Mexico from the federal government, pushing hard for the creation of a revenue sharing program that became the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act that now provides us with a real quality source of money for building levees, and has done, she did quite a few other things that help push the coastal restoration and the hurricane levee program forward.
And coastal restoration certainly is extremely important for us because that's our first line of defense against storms.
Absolutely, absolutely, and indeed, part of her program was the creation of the first coastal master plan, and that master plan said when we do these restoration projects, they're not just for nature, but they're to help be placed in locations where they're going to help protect the levees that protect us.
Mike Foster had sort of started looking at this to codify it sort
Right,
of in a way,
right. Mike Foster and King Milling, actually, in '98, when King first came out and said, I got a problem at Whitney National Bank. I can't give out loans in coastal areas because of how much it's costing me. He went to Mike Foster, and they started what was the first part of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which was an advisory body for coastal issues.
So a good legacy, though, from
Absolutely.
both Governor Foster having started this and then Kathleen Blanco taking the ball and running with it.
Right.
All right, thanks a lot, Mark. All right, John, over to you. This is kind of a complicated story, and you have 40 seconds to say it. No, I'm teasing. You have about 3 minutes or so to talk about it, maybe a little bit more than that. This is about a state Supreme Court justice currently sitting who, when he was a district judge, was involved in a custody case, and there's some questions about it that led to an FBI investigation. So now you take it from here.
Yes, the justice is Jefferson Hughes. He's from the North Shore. He was serving as a district judge in Livingston Parish 20 years ago when this all happened. It was more than one case that he ended up writing apology letters to parties in those cases over that never came out. It was in one case that the FBI investigated him, and it was over kind of tug of war over a 5-year-old boy who ended up burned in a scalding bathtub. And at the time, Judge Hughes took an interest in this case and pushed eventually for the boy to be placed in custody of his mother, who was with a man who was accused at the time and facing pending criminal charges for burning, for at least cruelty or burning the boy. So he got investigated for 5 years. Nothing happened with it in the end. It was investigated for a civil rights charge, allegation, not a charge, an allegation, and for some, apparently for some honest services fraud type of allegations as well.
And so there were no charges brought up in all of these investigations, but there was the question of recusal. Because in that custody case he was involved in, he also had a relationship with the attorney representing the mother and ultimately her new husband.
This attorney had represented the mother up until days before Judge Hughes at the time took his first proactive action on behalf of her client. She got off the case, but she was still on the criminal case of the boyfriend. It was a sort of, you could see that he tried to kind of firewall his participation, her participation in the case. But she was, according to our sources, dating him and having a romantic relationship with him at the time. Our ethics experts say that's kind of beyond the pale. But the Judiciary Commission looked into it. he was forced or agreed to, we don't know, write up these apologies that have never come out. So the series is kind of about the secrecy of this
Right, of the
commission
yeah.
process.
And because there was another case too, that it was another custody case.
That was
that he
contemporaneous.
looking
It was going on at the same time. He apologized. He wrote an apology letter. He has not told us exactly what he's apologized for. They were vague, kind of short written apology letters. He hasn't talked to us much about the case.
So he went on to become, he sat on what, the First Circuit Court of
So
Appeals?
First Circuit Court of Appeals and rose in 2012 to the Supreme Court. He was reelected last year without opposition to a 10-year term. He's aged out after this term is up, so he can't be elected to a judgeship again.
So as you said, the report really is to reveal or just to sort of disclose and describe all the more to the public out there the secrecy in the Judiciary Commission. What can be done about that?
And it goes beyond how they treat attorneys. It goes beyond how public officials in state government are treated in terms of the secrecy level, in terms of what little you can know until the Supreme Court actually disciplines somebody, actually gets a recommendation from the commission and says when the recommendation comes, it becomes public. But it rarely gets that far. I think last year it never got that far. So it's usually handled behind closed doors beforehand in these reprimands that never become public or disciplinary actions.
And meanwhile, people get caught up in, including that little boy who was scalded, who ultimately had to live in foster care.
And whose story's never been told for
All this time.
so many years.
Now he's a 26-year-old man.
Yeah.
And ultimately he was raised by his aunt, as I understand it.
It
It's just
turned
a
out
really sad
okay for
story.
him, but in that time he says he remembers it well.
All righty. All right, John. Thanks a lot. All right, time to look ahead. Dee.
Well, we're still feeling the hurt from the plane crash 2 weeks ago in which Nancy Parker was killed. Tomorrow at Lakefront Airport, there's going to be a memorial service for Franklin Augustus, who was the pilot, tomorrow afternoon.
Mark.
So we are approaching the height of the hurricane season, which is September 10th, and that means that we should all be already have in place a plan for what we're going to do if we are actually threatened with a hurricane and an evacuation is planned. So you should already have that written out for all your family members. Make sure you've got all of your documents ready to go. Anything you need to take with you, and that you've taken care of your pets and other family members who don't have the ability of leaving town. Make sure that they're taken care of.
Very important advice.
Absolutely.
Don.
Children's Museum, I'm just going to give it one more plug. So tomorrow is the free day, but you have to be ticketed. Sunday and Monday, they have extended hours from 9:30 until 7:30.
Okay.
So
So with the ticket, did they give you a time?
they give you,
frame
it's a
to-
time ticket. They want everybody to be able to spread out and enjoy it and not be overcrowded.
Okay, John.
Well, I'm also covering the Supreme Court race. There's Greg Guidry, who went to the federal bench, left an opening there. There are 4 candidates, and I will be asking them whether the judges among them have had judiciary complaints and what they were about, and we'll see what they say.
All right, we'll be looking for that. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a very happy, safe Memorial Day weekend.